Ani Kenoya, hello everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Matthew Indigenous cause. My name is Matthew. Monose Matthew. Ninki Science North. I work at Science North. Je travaille à Science Nord. And we are here live coming to you from Science North in Nshwaakamock in Sudbury, Ontario. And we are here today on the first annual National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and I hope that you've had a chance today to reflect on the residential school legacies and the ongoing and contemporary issues that our societies are facing right now, and have a time to reflect on those questions that we must all reflect upon. And so, to lead into what we are doing today, again, is we want to first and foremost, we want to acknowledge where we're coming from. And so, Science North is located on the traditional and ancestral lands of the Tikmikshing Anishinaabe, and also that of the Wanapate First Nation. And Science North also does recognize the cultural and economic contributions of the Métis First Nations, and would like to continue to extend our thank you to have us here on your lands as visitors. Today we have a special guest that I'm very excited to introduce you all to. We have Dr. Brock Pitawanakwat, and he is an associate professor and coordinator of Indigenous Studies program at York University. And Brock, for some context, he has his MA, he has his master's in Indigenous political movements, looking specifically at Southern Mexico. And his PhD dissertation explored language revitalization for the Anishinaabe in Manitoba and Ontario. He holds prior faculty appointments at First Nations University, the University of Winnipeg, and the University of Sudbury, where for that time I had the pleasure of studying under Brock and becoming a really close friend to him. And so, a little further is that his current research interests include Indigenous language revitalization, health, history, labor, and politics. And so I am excited to welcome Brock to our program today and to speak with you all on truth and reconciliation.
Bonjour, Miigwech. I really appreciate that introduction. Matt is a dear friend, and when he approached me and asked if I'd be willing to share a little bit of my research and experience around residential schools, I was so happy to do that. Of course, this is a very difficult topic, so I just want to let people know that certainly what I'm sharing isn't intended to upset anyone, but of course we're talking about residential school system that's had a tremendous impact on Indigenous people, and I would say really the country, and though that continues to the present day as well. So I'm going to just start by talking a little bit of the context of the residential school system, again, their legacy, so what are their ongoing impacts, and then I'll speak a little bit about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and how reconciliation is an ongoing process to this day. So in terms of the context of residential schools, I like to begin by sharing a specific quote from Canada's first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald. And this quotation comes from Hansard, so the official transcript in Parliament, where he was speaking to why residential schools were necessary. And so this is in 1883, and this is his quote. When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with his parents who are savages. He is surrounded by savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thought are Indian. Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence, where they will acquire the habits and modes of thought of white men. So I want to emphasize here that what was being proposed by the federal government is not reflective of what Indigenous people were seeking when they negotiated from Treaty 4 onward for there to be schools on reserve. And when First Nations people were doing that, it was with the idea they could see society was changing and they wanted, there's a sort of almost a cliche phrase now about learning the cunning of the white man, quote unquote. So First Nations people were aware that there was a new society on their borders with new techniques in terms of new technology as well, in terms of agriculture and other elements, and they wanted to make sure that their children and grandchildren and their future would be a prosperous one. And so that was why they entered into treaty with the promise that there would be schools on the reserves. Sadly, as we can see from this quotation, that view was not reciprocated. And in fact, what the Canadian government sought to do was to assimilate Indigenous people, and actually, rather than providing those communities with a future as Indigenous peoples, to ensure the opposite, that Indigenous peoples would ultimately disappear. Now, I want to give a sense of just how broad an issue this is. Certainly, there are families in the area of Northern Ontario who had children who attended the schools, but really it's so much broader than a regional issue. And I think this particular map speaks to that. So this map came from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and you can see that all of the little tiny dots there represent our federally recognized residential school. So you can see the number here is extensive. And it's also important to point out that there were other schools as well, because some were funded privately, some were run entirely by churches, others were run by the provinces, but these were the ones that were run by the federal government, I should say funded by the federal government, and then often in collaboration with the churches. They were staffed by church priests, nuns, other staff that were hired to provide not only an English language or a French language education, but also spiritual training or religious training according to the Catholic or Protestant people who ran each of those residential schools. So when I show this map, I want to emphasize that you can see there were schools in virtually every part of the country. There was in Atlantic Canada. You can see the Pitawanakwat School, for instance, in Nova Scotia. You end up having schools as well in Quebec, throughout the north, and then really northwestern Ontario and across the prairie provinces into Alberta and British Columbia. That's where you saw the highest number of the schools. So they were concentrated primarily in northwestern Ontario and further west, of course, because that was where at this point, the majority of Indigenous people lived. So on top of this system being extensive and really a national one in terms of geography, it also had an incredible timeline. So the system itself, and by that I mean when the federal government tried to organize the schools and fund them as a national policy, this lasted from the 1880s to the 1990s, so over a century. And again, these schools were government funded and church operated. That was usually the model that existed. There were schools that were in operation well before this time. For instance, my children's grandmother on their mother's side attended the Mohawk Institute, and that school had been in operation since the 1820s, if I remember correctly. And so there were pre-existing models in Canada. There were as well internationally. People have pointed out that a similar model of assimilative education was applied, for instance, in Ireland to assimilate Irish children, and also in the United States. The Bureau of Indian Affairs also operated a boarding school, which is really the model for the residential school system that we have in Canada. In terms of the experience of the schools, for many students, it was a very harsh transition. So they were removed from students were removed from their families, removed from their communities, and generally were put into a school where they did not speak the language, they did not understand the cultural norms. And often this occurred when the children were really young. Quite early in the development of the system, families began to hear back accounts of abuse and mistreatment and malnourishment and the prevalence of disease in the schools. Early on, there were often very high death rates from communicable diseases. And so parents started to resist the residential school system and try to prevent their kids from attending. So after 1920, the federal government's response was, rather than to really improve conditions in the schools, although there was a very limited attempt to do that, their decision was to pass a law which made it illegal for families to prevent their kids from being taken away. And so after 1920, parents could be arrested and fined, put in jail, if they tried to prevent their kids from attending the schools. We now know that at least 150,000 students attended. Approximately 100,000 former students, often referred to as survivors, are still alive to this day. These are conservative numbers. Over 200,000 people applied, for instance, to the federal government for compensation, the so-called common experience payment for all former students. So we know that these numbers, as I mentioned, are probably higher than what we have. In terms of the experience at the school, as I mentioned, many students suffered from abuse and neglect. We now know, thanks to the research efforts to look at the grounds of former residential school sites, there's a greater understanding of, I'd say, greater public understanding of the losses, the deaths of Indigenous students while attending these schools. So the so-called 215 moment, where it was found that approximately 215 unmarked graves were found on the former site of the Kamloops Indian Residential School, and subsequent schools have also come forward. So we're seeing this growing awareness that these schools were deadly for, we know, thousands of students during their operation. But beyond that as well, it's important to understand that students suffered abuse, neglect, as I mentioned, malnourishment. But a very universal experience for students who attended was that they were isolated from their community, isolated from their families. By definition, as we heard in the earlier quote from Prime Minister Macdonald, that was in fact its purpose. And as a result of that, students were deprived of their culture and often deprived of their languages as well, their ancestral Indigenous languages. I wanted to share this photo because for me, this is the moment that I first became aware of the residential school system and its impact on my family. So right at the center of the photo there's a pair of stocking feet beside the caption, and that is a picture of my grandmother. And so she and many other family members as well attended the Spanish Indian Residential School. And my mom, who was alive at the time, this was I think about 30 years ago, was flipping through a book called The Ojibwe of Southern Ontario by Peter Schmaltz. And she came across this photo and just spotted her mom. So there was no caption that identified who the students were, but she was able to recognize her mother just based on the picture. And so this sparked a whole conversation in our family where we were talking about the long-term impacts in terms of family dynamics, parents who had never actually been raised in a family home and instead been raised in an institution, and as a result of that, often struggled to be nurturing, caring parents because they themselves were denied that as children. So it ended up giving some insights into all these different family dynamics. And really from that point on, I sort of saw the residential school experience as being sort of the missing piece on the puzzle of my own family history that ended up just providing a better picture of what certainly what my grandmother, but other family members had to experience and persevere through in their childhood. Now, many of these former students were graduated from the schools, and only as adults really began to question what they experienced as children. And ultimately, what ended up happening is a large number of former students organized a class action lawsuit. And when this happened, they ended up challenging the churches, again, who ran the schools, and then the federal government who funded the schools in court with a whole series of lawsuits which were consolidated. And then a negotiation began. The federal government and the churches realized that they were going to lose if this went to court. And so they agreed to an out-of-court settlement, essentially. So there was a settlement. And out of that, the common experience payment, as I mentioned earlier, so it was a financial payout to former students who had attended the schools. And it was a formula based on the number of years they'd actually attended. And then also the independent assessment process, the IAP. And these two were the main parts of the settlement agreement that dealt with financial contributions by the federal government primarily, but also the churches to compensate former students. So the one part that I want people to take away, because this is something that's often not known, is that it was the desire of the former students, so for the survivors of residential schools, to make sure that there was commemoration so that the broader public knew that residential schools existed, and also that there be what was initially referred to as an inquiry, a national inquiry into the residential school system to find out exactly what happened, who was responsible, and again, to make sure that something like this would never be allowed to happen again. So the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was actually funded from the settlement agreement. So in that sense, it was the former students, the survivors themselves, who paid for the commission's work. The federal government resisted certain parts of it. I should say the federal government and the churches resisted. For instance, there were no subpoena powers that went to the TRC, so they could not compel someone to come and speak to them. Instead, the commission could only seek people out and invite them to share their statements with the TRC. The TRC was also authorized to collect any documents that dealt with the histories of the schools. So those were the major components of the TRC's mandate, was sort of broad public education about the school system, to conduct research on the school system, and then again to take those results of their research and also put forward some recommendations in terms of what reconciliation might look like. So how would Canada as a country and Canadians as a society help undo some of the harms, the lasting harms from the residential school system? So that was what the TRC commissioners who are pictured here, Willie Littlechild on the left, Justice Murray Sinclair, the chair in the center, and Dr. Marie Wilson. These three commissioners were responsible for organizing the commission, staffing it. They also organized the gathering of statements. So this was like the oral history component, where people would come and meet with TRC representatives and sometimes the commissioners themselves to talk about their experience at the schools. This was open to not only former students, but also sometimes referred to as intergenerational survivors, so children or even grandchildren of former students. It was also extended to former staff, so former teachers or those who had worked in some way in supporting the school system could and did come forward to speak to the commission. There were also 7 national events, which were held in different parts of the country, again, to try to raise awareness about residential school history and invite people to come forward and speak to the commission. Similarly, there were smaller community events that were held all around the country, and these were often important sites in terms of community healing events. So the commissioners would come and hold a circle, and former students often, but also other community members could come forward and talk directly to the commissioners. These were also important sites in terms of gathering statements, so where people would come and speak and offer that to the commission. I worked with primarily with the research group, so our task was to sort of work along 3 broad themes. Again, the history of the residential school system, the legacy, so the ongoing consequences of the residential school system, and finally map out what reconciliation might look like. So those were the 3 tasks of the research team. And finally, to establish a national research center, because when the TRC was established, it only was granted a few years to do its work and ended up receiving extensions. But the National Research Center, which is now based in Winnipeg and also virtually, is the legacy, essentially. So the documents, the institutional memory of the TRC, and the statements, and again the written documents that have been collected to help fill in a broader history of the residential school system are located there. There's also been other commemorative projects. In the most recent federal election, there was a promise from the Liberal Party to fund future commemorative projects as well. So this is ongoing. So that kind of brings me up to the present in terms of where we are with the federal government. It changed during the TRC's work. So initially it began under the Harper Conservative government, and then the Liberal government took over towards the TRC's end. The Liberals campaigned on promises, many promises, but also I'd say the most sweeping was a commitment by the Liberal government to implement all of the TRC's calls to action. So the recommendations, as they were phrased, calls to action. They also promised to bring in the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples, so UNDRIP, and promised the free, prior, and informed consent for any development on Indigenous lands. So these promises were actually kind of bundled together, because the TRC's calls to action included the need to bring UNDRIP into Canadian law, and then the free, prior, and informed consent was embedded within UNDRIP and the TRC calls to action. So there were very high hopes in terms of the incoming Liberal government 6 years ago. Justin Trudeau famously said that reconciliation meant that the most important relationship his government had was with Indigenous people. And certainly it's evident that there has been significant changes in terms of the federal government's willingness to address certain issues, at least prior to in comparison to its predecessors. I think one of the most noteworthy parts of this, or most important evidence, I'd say, of that change was the Liberal government's commitment to have a national public inquiry into Canada's missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So this had been a long-standing social movement that was led by Indigenous women, and the Harper government had stonewalled. They refused to address it in any significant way, and to its credit, the Trudeau government did establish an inquiry in its first mandate, and is on the verge, it seems, of finally coming around with a national response. So in its recent electoral campaign, the Trudeau government promised to have an extended series of policies and funding to address the calls for justice that came from the MMIWG inquiry. Other changes have been around funding. So there's been more investments around water, for instance, on reserves and in other northern Indigenous communities. And we've also seen promises in terms of new funding in education. And specifically, there have been investments in terms of Indigenous languages. And I think that's particularly important because in the context of residential schools, obviously Indigenous languages were targeted. And both the TRC and the MMIW inquiry emphasized the importance of Indigenous people being able to reclaim their ancestral languages as an important act of justice and reconciliation in Canada. So that's essentially where things are at. Obviously, today was the first National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. This whole concept of reconciliation really emerged only in the last 25 years, where coming out of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1996, and specifically through the work of former residential school students by survivors themselves, to make sure that Canadians, first of all, knew about the residential school system, were aware of its impacts, ongoing impacts on Indigenous peoples, and their determination to hold Canada and the churches accountable for what Indigenous children experience in these schools. So I will end there, and I look forward to your comments and questions. Matt will be assisting with those, and if anyone has specific feedback for me, I'd like to share my email address. And again, miigwech for listening.
Miigwech, Brock, for providing this overview of this really dark part of the history of this country, and providing further context into the beginnings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and how it relates to the United Nations Declaration, the Royal Commission back in '96, and so on. So I think that with providing a bit of this context for our viewers, I think that there may be there's some questions that are coming up that I think that individuals may be looking to have answered. And so I think first and foremost, knowing that our Science North audience is exceptionally diverse, and there are many people who may not identify as Indigenous. And so I think first and foremost, I think that maybe having this as a new day, this new day of Truth and Reconciliation, from your experiences, and your work with Indigenous communities across Turtle Island, are there any, coming, and you spoke on the recommendations, the calls to action, but with that, like, are there any unified, like, hopes, desires of what reconciliation really looks like, for Indigenous people, and how that they're bringing that forward?
Yeah, when I first started working with the TRC, one thing that stood out for me is I worked initially directly with Justice Marie Sinclair, who was the commission chair. And I remember he showed me on a notepad that I think he had, I can't remember the exact number, but already come up with approximately, it was like 3 or 4 pages of synonyms, possible synonyms or definitions of what reconciliation could mean. And I think that's been one of the real challenges, is it's kind of an unclear term, like at what point are we reconciled? What does that look like? And I recently wrote a policy piece for the Yellowhead Institute, and it was looking at Indigenous electoral engagement. So for First Nations people who are participating in the recent election, what does it mean to vote Indigenous, or what does it mean to vote reconciliation? And that isn't very clear, I'd say, for the broader public. and understandably, it means a lot of different things for Indigenous people as well. I think in the terms of the TRC, and it speaks to this in their final report, which I encourage people, it's available online, it's free. So I encourage people to look at it. But it's really about the relationship that exists between settler society and Indigenous peoples in Canada, and trying to ensure that that is a respectful relationship and not one where one party perceives itself as more important than the other. And unfortunately, in the Canadian context, we have a long history of what's often referred to as paternalism. And in fact, that was even to some extent true in terms of the legal relationship, where First Nations people were denied like sort of the humanity that other people take for granted legally. And we were, the phrase that's often used is wards of the state. So, and that's reflected in all sorts of ways, that First Nations people only acquired the right to vote in the late 1950s, early 1960s. First Nations people weren't allowed to graduate from a university or become a clergy or become a medical doctor or even join the military potentially without fear of then being legally stripped of their indigeneity or their Indian status, as it was referred to then, and to some extent still is today. So I think all of those aspects of it make that notion of reconciliation really complicated, because I think there's a lot of sort of unlearning that has to go first in terms of again, perceptions among settler society that Indigenous people are inferior or somehow incapable of running their own affairs, when in fact Indigenous people did that for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years before settlers arrived. And we're seeing more and more evidence that Indigenous leadership is actually needed, not just within our own communities, but more broadly than that. And I think a good example of that is around climate, that Indigenous peoples have ancient practices that are better related to the lands we live on, the waters we live on, than settler society has been able to provide. So I think in terms of what reconciliation means, that's still to be defined. It's also going to be very specific to the location. One of the things that I'll just add, I'll close with this, but the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, its calls to action were extremely broad. So they were addressed to the corporate sector, higher education, municipal governments, individual Canadians, like essentially, I would also include now, since this has happened since the TRC finished its work, the inquiring into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. That also has an extensive section of calls for justice. So to my mind, at a minimum, the minimum bar would be to actually implement these inquiries and studies that we've had. And the major ones that come to mind over the last 25 years, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the TRC and its calls to action, which now is, I mean, that's several years ago now that the TRC completed its work. And similarly, the inquiry into MMIWG.
Well, you've unpacked a lot. I think that and you're right in saying, it's an exceptionally multifaceted issue, all having very similar links. And I think that one thing you mentioned, and I think one is with the recent election that we did have, and so on, is like, how do you vote for reconciliation? And that was a major topic that we did see in the debates. One thing that I would like to maybe hear you speak on is also understanding of a little more about how we can see a progression to having more of a nation-to-nation relationship, because, as you mentioned, it being extremely paternalistic in nature, the Canadian project. So, what would you think people would like to see in that sense? How would they like to see that representation occur in our greater political arena?
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky. As you can see, Canada is a massive country. We just looked at the map a short time ago, and there's very different uh, economies. I mean, people live differently on the East Coast versus the Arctic versus the prairies. And so I think in that sense, the solutions are going to come best when they come from communities figuring them out together. So, and there's many opportunities to do this because you find Indigenous peoples in every part of the country. We have, reserves, Métis communities, Inuit communities all over, and increasingly in urban areas as well. So, to my mind, nation to nation is something that the federal government has the rhetoric, right? Like they speak about Indigenous nations, but they still tend to address Indigenous peoples as individual like communities, like the local community. And I think one of the things, for instance, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, they proposed a model that was based on nationhood, and that would have allowed for similar to essentially, and again, this is something that would be controversial to say, but even how we have the two orders of government in Canada, with you have the national Canadian government, but you also have very strong regional or provincial governments here with separate jurisdictions. I think that's the model that Indigenous people would say or should exist at a minimum. But unfortunately, the problem has been Canada and the provinces and the territories to some extent don't recognize or honor Indigenous jurisdiction. In fact, trample all over it. And that's part of the reason why, like towards the end of my talk, I emphasize that element of the free, prior, and informed consent, which is what is embedded in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and is considered like a minimum standard in international law for what Indigenous people should have. And when Indigenous peoples have the right to say yes or no to development on their lands, then I think we're getting to the nation to nation level of respect, mutual respect.
Well, Miigwech for sharing that, and I it's something that we spoke of much. We our time spent together, and I know many people have these same views, and but again, it's these concepts and notions, like you mentioned, like the idea of controversy. A lot of this is new for people. Just this day in itself, being recognized across Turtle Island, or across of what we know as Canada, as this day of recognition and mourning, as it's coming to the forefront, and people are seeking more answers. Do you have any? And this is, I guess, a somewhat superficial question, but did you have any recommendations on resources that people, our listeners, could seek out to learn more about the residential school history and legacy, to learn more, as you mentioned, there's free access to the Truth and Reconciliation's final report. Is there anything that stands out for you that you think may be really of value for those who are listening?
Yeah, I mean, now I think we're fortunate that we live at a time where Indigenous voices are increasingly supported and promoted. So I would say yes, like in terms of for those of us who might be a little more academic or bookish, certainly you have a lot of resources, but you also have like tremendous Indigenous achievement in the arts, in government. Like it doesn't have to be within academic research for people to have those kinds of experiences. And in terms of really understanding Indigenous peoples and their nationhood. So in terms of your question, I continue to think the TRC report is a terrific place for people to access information about the history. But in terms of what reconciliation means, that's going to be ever changing in terms of just as a society, develops and changes, it's going to mean something else, 5 years or 10 years from now than it does today. So I think, and I also want to emphasize too, that I think reconciliation has kind of gotten a bad rap in some ways, because as I mentioned, it is so nebulous in some ways. Like, it's so hard to define that sometimes I think people attempt to take advantage of that and in some ways appropriate, I would say misappropriate, the spirit of reconciliation into something else. And so I think that's something, when people think of it in the context of justice, for instance, or of respect, I think when you keep those things in mind, then if those are the goals, then that's when reconciliation can be achieved. It shouldn't be something about, for instance, like one of the expressions that you often hear as an Indigenous person is like, let's just forget it and move on. And I think that's hugely problematic, especially when it's coming from settler folks. If that's the perspective, then that suggests to me that somebody's actually closing off the opportunity to really engage in a deep and meaningful conversation with Indigenous peoples, or others that just care about living in a better country or in a better society. So again, I think those are really sort of like broad things. That's why, again, like the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, that's another tremendous resource for people to understand about the impacts of anti-Indigenous racism and colonialism, how those have affected us in the past and continue to the present. I think those are really good resources in terms of the TRC, the MMIW inquiry, and then also, again, the RCAP report, which is now that's hard to believe, 1996. So it's now 25 years since RCAP came about. But all three of those, again, all available for free online, and anybody can access them.
Oh, miigwech, and that's great. And I think that's especially being free and public accessibility is exceptionally important. Mm-hmm. There's no barrier to learning more about this. So that was kind of finding resources. So we have a great question from Sarah, one of our Facebook audience members. Right. As you can probably see, so what it says is, her question is, from a practical sense, how do we as individuals and communities support the ongoing process of reconciliation? And so again, as you've mentioned, reconciliation it's not well defined, but any thoughts on that practical sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's all sorts of ways. It can be supporting a colleague. It can be supporting a student in your class. It can be just being aware of how embedded colonial thinking is in our society. And if you find yourself in any situation, whether it's like the parent council at your local school, and you look around and realize, you wonder, well, where are the Indigenous representatives? Where are the Indigenous voices here? And then trying to make sure that in any aspect of your life, that these absences are noted, because it's hard for Indigenous people to have any influence or impact if we're not even in the room. Whether it's again at the community level or at the federal cabinet. So I think in that sense, there's something anyone can do, and certainly, obviously, like there's moments where we absolutely do need people to step up. Like if you witness anti-Indigenous racism and hatred, and all you have to do is go online and scroll through the comments of virtually any news story that has any mention of Indigenous peoples, and you'll find plenty, like really vile stuff. So there's clearly a very strong current of anti-Indigenous racism and resentment towards Indigenous people's survival or well-being. So when you witness that, call it out and challenge it, because often that's a burden that Indigenous people have to shoulder alone. And when other people are willing to do that, it has a tremendous impact. And that I can attest. I've seen you do this for me, where I've been in situations where I have a non-native person giving me the gears, and you've stepped up and just politely, as you do, and in your quiet, respectful way, a much calmer than I could potentially be, but be able to intervene, and that's incredibly helpful. And I think any person can do that, is when they see something that they looks and smells and, you know, unjust and unfair, well, then people can again call that out and support.
Miigwech, and yeah, that is those are exceptionally practical ways of being an ally. I think, or I think it was one of our close colleagues, you know, who's kind of stated more like Indigenous minded, rather so much than an ally, but somebody who's more yeah, Indigenous minded, and even as a settler individual.
The other phrase I like that I've heard before is somebody who's willing to be an accomplice. Like, actually get in there and do the dirty work, not just stand by after the dust settles and say, yeah, I was on your side. Don't wait till it's over.
You got to
get in there and get dirty while the action's on.
Absolutely. Well, Miigwech, and thank you, Sarah, for sharing that question. I think that I mean, there's no real timeline. I think that this is important to unpack a few more things. You know, with what you were last saying, with this last question we had, talking about these types of sentiments that we come across in Canadian society, and how that has trickled in and been formed from you know, prior views and sometimes our institutional you know, ways. Like, so really at the end of the day, there is a systemic issue in terms of how we have framed our relationship as settlers, how we have framed our relationship with Indigenous peoples. And so in terms of looking at a system-wide problem, a societal-wide problem, I think that one of the remedies, and we've spoken about this, and you know, we have young children, is that can you have any thoughts on how our current education system is starting to, you know, really involve Indigenous ways of knowing and seeing and thought? Are you feeling like there is the wave is starting to grow, and that you know, our young children are starting to become more aware of these relationships that are very important, and to then proceed and continue on that work of reconciliation? Are you seeing that happening? Do you have any thoughts on this?
I mean, yes, I do. I think early childhood education has probably, I mean, I know it had a transformative impact on me in terms of the people who took care of me when I was, you know, 3-4 years old. And certainly I think that's important. I actually woke up this morning to a text from a friend who lives on the West Coast, and she was mentioning that her 3-year-old son understands that when he goes into the forest, he says "haichka," which is like essentially like it's similar to miigwech in Anishinaabe, and it's like almost like a mini prayer, an expression of gratitude. And he's a non-native child, but he's learning the Indigenous language of the territory he's on, Coast Salish territory, also known as Victoria, British Columbia. And so his mom and I were both kind of marveling that children now are learning these things, and that's incredibly exciting. As you and I both are parents to young kids. My partner is actually a high school teacher, used to teach primary, and she's giving a talk right now at the local, at the Parry Sound Friendship Center here in town, where they've organized a rally for today, for the National Day on Truth and Reconciliation. And so I know that certainly primary and secondary educators early childhood educators. I think they have a huge role to play in terms of supporting reconciliation and Indigenous learners in their classrooms. I think we're also seeing it, like as you mentioned when you introduced me, I've had the opportunity to work now at a few different institutions. So First Nations University in Regina, Saskatchewan, University of Winnipeg, University of Sudbury, and now at York University. And at all of those places, I've seen interest in Indigenous issues just continue to grow. So I really think that there's, and that's something that Justice Murray Sinclair, when he was the chair, he had a phrase he liked to use, that it was education that got us into this mess, like referring to the residential school system, and then it's education that's going to get us out. So definitely teachers and educational institutions have a huge role to play.
Absolutely. And you know what? I've had the pleasure to hear Justice Murray Sinclair, the Honorable Justice Murray Sinclair, speak a few times. And I think that, and not to take his any of his thunder away, but I think one of the most impactful things that he did, and I'll briefly say it, is that in his talk, the initial thing he said, and most people have their cell phones on them or a wallet with pictures of their family, and is that if there's someone who's coming in as an outsider and not knowing what we're going to embark upon as a journey of reconciliation and understanding this history, he said, take your phone out, take your wallet out, and look at a picture of a young child, like either your own daughter or son, or another family member, someone that you love and cherish, and try to then put into context how you would feel if this was to be your legacy. And I always thought that was one of the most incredibly powerful things that he could have done in terms of really relating to individuals in a room. I see here, we're coming. I think we'll be shortly coming to an end of our talk, but I want to see here. June has a question, one of our YouTube audience members, and so she asks, and is there anything that you would want a future social services worker like herself that might work with Indigenous peoples in the future? Is there anything that you would like to see occur?
Well, that's an excellent place to finish too, because a lot of people have made the case, and I think rightly, that we need to be careful that we don't talk about colonialism as something that's just in the past. And in some ways, I think that's also one of the challenges with having a national statutory day like today that focuses too much on residential school legacy, as if, again, residential schools are all in the past, because I think that would be unfair and inaccurate, because there are so many ways that colonialism continues. And many people have made the point that there are more kids in care, like in the child welfare system in this country now, than were during the residential school system. So you have so many Indigenous kids who are vulnerable in a child welfare system that, again, continues to be something that is in many ways alien to them, like doesn't understand them culturally. And it's really important, I think. We're seeing this attempt at Indigenous communities asserting more control over their child welfare systems, and that's expanding. Like right now, you're seeing that transition, and I think that's something that's really important to support. There will always be situations, I believe, where Indigenous children will still be in care, but through the work of Cindy Blackstock, for instance, I think she's anybody who wants to work in social services or in sort of a social work field, I feel would benefit tremendously from looking specifically at Cindy Blackstock's legacy in terms of being an advocate for Indigenous children in care and constantly challenging the federal government to do better And we just ended up hearing, I think it was yesterday or this morning even, that the Canadian Court of Appeal denied an attempt by the federal government to undo the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal finding of compensation to Indigenous children in the child welfare system in Canada. So there's a lot. There's a lot there. I think. I mean, it's an excellent question. That's one of the things that, again, that I would mention. The TRC calls to action. There's a whole range of different calls that are sector specific. So, like in social services, in the media, in the legal profession, certainly for educators as well, and so the medical profession. So you'll be able to find a whole different range. But really, what it comes down to is for people to, again, educate themselves, talk to their neighbors, and again, learn about the Indigenous people of your territory. Like, who are your Indigenous neighbors, and what is the history of the land that you live and work upon? I think those are important steps that everyone should take.
Miigwech, that's absolutely very wise. Words and advice for those unknowing of what are those next steps as individuals, either through a career or through personal endeavors. And I think that's a great place to come to a close. Is there anything else that you'd like to add, or?
No, I mean, again, miigwech for the opportunity. I really wish I could have been there in person to participate in the full day of activities that you've had, but I'm super grateful for the chance to have this conversation with you. And again, I wish you well on the rest of the day.
Miigwech, yeah, absolutely. Well, we're always here to welcome you. My place is always open. So, again, Miigwech, Brock, and I want to say the same to all of our audience members, even here at Science North currently, for our National Day of Truth and Reconciliation events going on here, and also those online with our YouTube and Facebook audiences. Miigwech and Bama P, we'll talk later. So thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you. Miigwech.